The most feared crime boss on the East Coast walked into a dusty corner grocery store to burn it to the ground, and the man behind the counter didn't flinch. He simply said one name. And Dominic Viscari, a man who hadn't felt fear in 40 years, went completely still for the first time in his life. What you're about to hear is not just a story about organized crime. It's about a truth buried 25 years beneath a forgotten basement, and the one quiet man who protected it long enough to bring down an entire empire. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain came in sideways that October night, the kind that soaked through your collar before you even stepped off the curb. Dominic Viscari stood on the corner of Aldrin Street and watched the water run black along the gutter, carrying cigarette butts and fast food wrappers toward the drain. He'd stood on 100 corners like this one. He'd owned most of them. He was 43 years old. His hair had gone silver at the temples 2 years ago, and he'd let it stay that way because nobody in his organization had the nerve to mention it. He wore a charcoal wool overcoat that cost more than most of his soldiers made in a month. His shoes were Italian. His watch was Swiss. Everything about him said old money, except old money didn't usually have the kind of hands Dominic had, thick-knuckled, slightly scarred along the left index finger where a blade had caught him when he was 19. He looked at the grocery store across the street. It was embarrassing, frankly. The kind of place that shouldn't have survived into the 21st century. Hand-painted letters on the front window. Mercer's General. Est. 1999. One of the M's had started to peel at the corner. A string of yellow bulbs ran along the overhang, half of them burned out. Through the foggy glass he could see canned goods stacked unevenly on wooden shelves, a refrigerator case with a handwritten sign taped to it, and a single overhead fluorescent tube flickering like it was trying to send a distress signal. "You sure he's in there?" Dominic asked without turning around. His enforcer, a thick-necked man named Caruso, stood 3 feet behind him with an umbrella he wasn't offering to share. "Lights are on. Doors unlocked. Guy never closes before 10. "How many times we send someone?" 3. First time Marco went in friendly, explained the arrangement. Mercer listened, said he'd think about it. Second time we sent 2 guys. He offered them coffee. Caruso paused. Third time, he told them the store wasn't under anyone's protection because it didn't need protecting. Dominic finally turned to look at Caruso. Caruso shifted his weight. "I know. He told our people the store doesn't need protecting." "Yes, this man. This grocery store man." Dominic looked back at the flickering bulb in the window. "He said that. Word for word. Luca wrote it down because he thought you'd want to know exactly." Dominic exhaled slowly through his nose. In another life, the life his father had apparently wanted for him, though Dominic had only understood that in fragments and rumors, maybe he'd have found this funny. A stubborn old shop owner refusing the machine. Classic, admirable even, in some dead romantic version of the world. But this wasn't that world. The Aldrin Street corridor brought in $11,000 a week in protection revenue. That number was irrelevant. What mattered was the message. One holdout became 2. 2 became a neighborhood. A neighborhood became a problem. Dominic had inherited an empire built on the principle that examples were cheaper than wars, and he'd maintained it for 15 years by making sure everyone understood that principle before they needed a demonstration. He buttoned the top button of his overcoat. "Stay here," he said. Caruso blinked. "Boss? I said stay!" He crossed the street alone. The bell above the door made a small apologetic sound when he pushed it open. The store smelled like old wood, coffee, and something faintly electrical, like a machine that had been running for years without anyone checking the wiring. Dominic scanned the room in 2 seconds flat. Narrow aisles, shelves that looked older than the building. A small television on a shelf behind the counter playing a weather forecast on mute. Beside it, a half-disassembled radio with its guts spread across a folded newspaper. The man behind the counter looked up. He was maybe 60, possibly older. Medium height, slightly stooped at the shoulders the way men get when they've spent decades leaning over a workbench. He had a plain face, the kind you'd forget 30 seconds after passing on the street, with deep-set gray eyes and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He wore a flannel shirt, dark trousers, and an apron that had been washed so many times the original color was anyone's guess. He looked at Dominic the way you'd look at a neighbor who'd come to borrow a ladder. Calm, unhurried. Evening, the man said. Wet out there. Dominic moved to the counter. He didn't rush. He let the silence do the preliminary work, the way he'd learned before he was old enough to drive. He set both hands flat on the counter and looked at the man for a long moment. You're Mercer. I am. You know who I am. The man tilted his head slightly, the way someone does when they're considering whether a question deserves a full answer. I know who you are, Mr. Viscari. Then you know why I'm here. I imagine so. I'm not going to waste your time explaining the arrangement again, Dominic said. My people have done that 3 times. You've made your position clear. Now I'm here to make mine clear. He paused. This building burns tomorrow night. Everything in it. I'll have city permits pulled so the lot sits empty for 2 years while the insurance dispute gets sorted. Your neighbors will understand what happened and why. That's the end of Mercer's General. He watched the man's face throughout all of this. He was very good at reading faces. It was one of the skills that had kept him alive. Elias Mercer's face didn't change. Not a tremor around the mouth, not a flicker in those gray eyes. His breathing stayed even, his shoulders stayed relaxed, and his hands, Dominic noticed, stayed completely still on the counter where he'd placed them when Dominic walked in. I understand, Mercer said. Good. Can I ask you something first? Dominic waited. The building is mine. The stock is mine. 25 years of my life are in this store. Mercer spoke without bitterness, just stating facts. If I'd wanted to protect any of that, I'd have done things differently a long time ago. So burning it doesn't frighten me the way you're expecting it to. He paused. What I want you to consider, Mr. Viscari, is that destroying this building would also destroy something you have spent your entire life looking for, something you don't even know exists. Dominic stared at him. Of all the responses he'd anticipated, begging, negotiation, attempted bribery, the occasional desperate lunge at something sharp, this was not among them. He kept his expression flat. Is that right? Yes. And what is it I've supposedly spent my life looking for? Elias Mercer looked at him steadily. The truth about your father, he said, about what really happened to Marco Viscari in the winter of 1999. The store was very quiet. The fluorescent tube flickered twice above them. Outside, rain tapped against the window glass. The muted weatherman on the small television gestured at a map of the coast. Dominic felt something happen inside his chest that he hadn't felt in longer than he could clearly remember. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the body's recognition of something it wasn't prepared for. A kind of cold stillness that moved up from the stomach and spread outward. His father's name. His father's full name, spoken plainly, without hesitation, by this nobody in a flannel shirt in a dying grocery store on a street that barely appeared on GPS. He'd heard his father's name 1,000 times. In eulogies, in toasts, in the careful way his Uncle Salvatore used to invoke it during organizational meetings like a saint's name offered before a decision. Marco Viscari, who built this. Marco Viscari, who wanted us to be stronger. Marco Viscari, who understood that weakness was the only true sin. But nobody, not once in 15 years of running this empire, had ever said that name to his face without either reverence or fear. This man had said it like it was a key. Start talking, Dominic said. His voice was level. He was proud of that. Mercer didn't move from behind his counter. There are things I can tell you standing here, and there are things I can only show you. The first category won't mean much without the second. He reached beneath the counter and set something on the surface between them. A small envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with tape that had gone brittle. That's for after. Before we go any further, I need you to know one thing. Dominic looked at the envelope. Didn't touch it. What thing? I've been waiting for you for a very long time, Mercer said. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. He removed his glasses from his forehead and set them aside. Your father asked me to. That was when Dominic's phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Then Caruso's voice came through, low and tight, on the earpiece he'd stopped noticing he was wearing. Boss? We got movement. 2 SUVs, east end of the block. Plates are blocked. Dominic kept his eyes on Mercer. Yours? Mercer's expression didn't shift. No, but if they're here already, then someone else knows this conversation is happening. He glanced once at the window, and that changes things considerably. Dominic pulled out his phone. 3 missed calls from a number he recognized as his Uncle Salvatore's private line. He stared at those missed calls for 1 full second. Then he looked back at Mercer. "Is there a back way out of this building?" "Yes." "Is there anything beneath this store worth protecting?" Mercer held his gaze without blinking. "Everything," he said. "Every single thing that could change what you believe about your entire life." Outside, the rain picked up. Somewhere on the east end of Aldrin Street, headlights swept across the wet asphalt and didn't stop moving. Dominic put his phone away. He looked at this unremarkable man, this forgettable face, this worn apron, this half-repaired radio on a counter in a store that smelled like old wood, and made a decision that went against every instinct 15 years of survival had burned into him. "Show me," he said. Mercer didn't hesitate. He reached beneath the counter again, this time producing a flashlight and a ring of old keys. He moved around the end of the counter with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had rehearsed this moment for a very long time. He lifted a section of wooden flooring near the back wall. A hatch, hinged and seamless enough that Dominic had looked straight at it without registering it as a door. Beneath it, stone steps. Darkness below. Mercer turned on the flashlight and started down without looking back. Dominic stood at the edge of that opening and breathed the cold air rising from whatever lay beneath, the smell of stone and paper and time, and heard, through the front window, the sound of car doors closing on Aldrin Street. He followed the old man into the dark. The hatch closed above them, and for a moment the only light in the world was the pale beam of Mercer's flashlight moving across a basement wall. Then Mercer reached a bare bulb hanging from a wire and pulled the chain, and the room came to life. Dominic stopped breathing. The basement was approximately 30 feet by 20. Every wall was lined with shelving, heavy wooden shelves bolted to the stone, and on those shelves sat row after row of carefully organized materials. Bankers' boxes, sealed and labeled. Journals, their spines handwritten in a cramped shorthand. Binders filled with documents visible through their clear plastic covers. And along the far wall, a metal cabinet sealed with a combination lock, beside which sat a reel-to-reel audio machine of the kind Dominic hadn't seen since his childhood, when his father used to play old recordings of Sicilian folk music on a similar device in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. He hadn't thought about that memory in 20 years. "What is this?" Dominic said. It came out quieter than he intended. 25 years of documentation, Mercer said. He moved to the nearest shelf and touched one of the boxes without removing it, the way you'd rest your hand on something fragile. Financial records, surveillance logs, encrypted recordings. A complete picture of how the Viscari organization was built, and what it was built on top of. Dominic walked slowly along the wall of shelves. His eyes moved across the labels on the boxes. Dates, account numbers. He recognized the names of 3 shell corporations he'd believed were untraceable. He saw a label with the name of a federal judge who'd been on his uncle's payroll since before Dominic could drive. He saw a box simply labeled Marco, personal, and something tightened in his throat. "You said my father asked you to wait for me," Dominic said, still facing the shelves. "He did." "Who are you?" A pause. Then, "My name is Elias Mercer. Before this store, before this street, before the city knew me as anyone at all, I was a forensic accountant working undercover for a federal financial crimes unit." He paused again. "I worked alongside your father." Dominic turned around slowly. Mercer met his eyes without flinching. "Marco Viscari was not murdered by a rival family, Mr. Viscari. He was working to dismantle the empire from the inside. He'd seen what it had become, what it was doing to people who had nothing to do with it. And he wanted out, not just for himself, for you." He let that land. "Before he could complete what he started, he disappeared. And I've spent every year since then waiting for you to become someone who could hear that without ordering me to disappear too." Above them, muffled through the floorboards, Dominic heard the front door of the grocery store open. The bell made its small, apologetic sound, and then heavy footsteps, more than 2 sets, moved across the floor above their heads. Dominic and Mercer stood absolutely still in the cold basement light, and neither of them spoke. and the footsteps fanned out across the store in a search pattern that both men recognized for what it was. Not a robbery, not a shakedown, a sweep. Dominic looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at Dominic. And in the silence between them, in the space between a truth just spoken and a truth that hadn't fully landed yet, the real story of Dominic Viscari's life prepared to split itself open like something that had been sealed too long under too much pressure. The footsteps stopped directly above them, and someone knocked 3 times on the floor. 3 knocks on the floor above them. Not random, not the sound of someone stumbling over a loose board in the dark. 3 deliberate, evenly spaced impacts, the kind a boot heel makes when someone wants the people below to know they've been found. Dominic counted to 2 in his head before he moved. He grabbed Mercer by the forearm and pulled him toward the far wall without speaking. Mercer didn't resist, didn't ask questions, just moved, which told Dominic something about the old man that no amount of conversation could have. People who froze in moments like this were people who'd never genuinely faced one before. Mercer moved like someone reacquainting himself with an old reflex. Above them, the footsteps spread out again. At least 4 sets. Maybe 5. Moving with a practiced silence that wasn't quite silent enough. The particular sound of trained men trying not to sound like trained men, which always gave them away to someone who'd spent enough time listening for exactly that. Dominic pulled out his phone and killed the screen brightness. He typed a single message to Caruso. Basement confirmed. East exit. Now. He sent it and pocketed the phone without waiting for a response. He turned to Mercer and kept his voice at a level just above nothing. Is there another way out of this basement besides the hatch? Mercer pointed toward the back corner of the room where the shelving units didn't quite meet the wall. Maintenance tunnel. Connects to the old transit infrastructure 2 blocks south. Pre-war construction, so it's not on any current city maps. He paused. I made sure of that. How long have you had this planned? The old man's expression in the dim light was difficult to read. Which part of it? Dominic stared at him for half a second, then let it go. There was no time for that conversation, and they both knew it. He crossed to the metal cabinet with the combination lock and looked at it. The recording's in there. Yes. We're not leaving them. Mercer was already moving toward it, his fingers working the dial from memory. Right, left, right. The mechanical precision of someone who'd opened this particular lock 10,000 times in his imagination. The cabinet swung open. Inside, 3 rows of labeled audio reels sat in foam-lined cases alongside a flat metal box that looked like it might hold fishing equipment, but almost certainly didn't. Mercer pulled a canvas bag from behind the cabinet and began loading reels into it with practiced efficiency. The journals, Dominic said, looking at the shelves. Too many to carry. I have digital copies embedded in a system that will release automatically if I don't enter a specific code every 72 hours. Mercer didn't look up from the cabinet. Your uncle's lawyers have been trying to find that system for 6 years. Dominic processed that. 6 years. Which meant Salvatore had known about Mercer, or suspected something, for at least that long. Maybe longer. Which meant every business decision, every organizational restructuring, every new protocol Salvatore had quietly recommended over the past 6 years had been, at least in part, about finding this room. The magnitude of that settled over him like something physical. He pushed it back. Later, from above them came the new sound, furniture being moved. The refrigerator case, probably, or the heavy wooden shelving units along the south wall. They were looking for a hatch. They'd find it in under 3 minutes once they started pulling things away from the floor. Move, Dominic said. Mercer shouldered this canvas bag and led him to the back corner of the basement. Behind the last shelving unit, which swiveled outward on a pivot mounted to the floor, smooth enough that it had clearly been serviced recently, was a low stone archway, roughly 5 feet high, leading into darkness. The smell that came out of it was old water and cold concrete and something faintly metallic. Mercer turned on his flashlight. Dominic ducked through the archway and followed him in. The tunnel was narrow enough that his shoulders nearly brushed both walls. The ceiling was arched, old brick, with iron reinforcement bars visible at intervals. The floor was poured concrete, cracked in places, with a thin channel running along the center that still held a trickle of water from the night's rain, finding its way down through some crack in the earth above. Their footsteps were unavoidable. Each one echoed forward and backward simultaneously, so they moved as fast as the space allowed without pretending stealth was possible. Behind them, muffled but unmistakable, came the sound of the hatch being pulled open. Dominic didn't look back. They moved through the tunnel for what felt like 4 minutes, but was probably 2, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark 10 feet ahead of them, the sound of running water growing slightly louder as they went. Then the tunnel opened up, widened into a junction where 3 passages met in a circular space roughly the size of a large bedroom, with old iron doors set into 2 of the walls and a rusted ladder bolted to the 3rd. Mercer stopped and turned around. He was breathing harder than Dominic had expected, but his eyes were clear. He pointed to the iron door on the left. That goes west, comes up near the old warehouse district. Nobody's used it in 20 years. He pointed to the ladder. That goes up. Service access to a parking structure on Calloway Street, 2 blocks from the position you just texted your man. Dominic looked at him. I texted him 40 seconds ago. I know, I could see your screen. Dominic stood very still for a moment. Then he made a decision he knew he might regret and started up the ladder. The parking structure was half empty at this hour. The upper deck opened to the rain, wind cutting through the concrete pillars in long, sweeping gusts. Caruso was already there. White sedan pulled up near the stairwell exit, engine running, his thick silhouette visible through the driver's window. 2 of Dominic's men flanked the vehicle, hands inside their jackets, eyes working the surrounding levels. Dominic came up out of the service hatch with Mercer 2 steps behind him and moved to the car without breaking stride. Caruso got out. He looked at Mercer, then at Dominic. Who's the old man? Later, drive. They were moving before Caruso finished closing his door. The sedan's headlights off for the first 2 blocks, Dominic in the back seat with Mercer beside him and the canvas bag between their feet. The rain on the windshield came in waves. Caruso drove without asking where, which was why Dominic kept him. Mercer sat with his hands folded in his lap and his breathing coming back to something normal. He looked out the rain-streaked window at the city moving past and said nothing for almost 3 full minutes. Dominic spoke first. How long did you work with my father? 14 months. Mercer kept looking at the window. Long enough? Long enough for what? Long enough to understand what kind of man he was, and what kind of empire he'd built before he understood what it was becoming. He turned from the window. He didn't build it to last, Mr. Vescari. He built it to survive long enough to take it apart from the inside. That was always the intention. Dominic felt the familiar friction of a story that didn't match the one he'd been handed. He'd learned to be careful with that friction. It could mean you were hearing the truth, or it could mean someone had built a very good alternative. He'd seen both. My uncle told me my father was killed by the Carano family, he said. Northern Operation Border Dispute. I fought that war for 3 years. We won it. Mercer's expression didn't change. The Carano family had nothing to do with your father's disappearance. You say that with a lot of confidence for a grocery store owner. I say it because I was there. Mercer's voice stayed flat. Not aggressive, just certain, the way a man is certain about things he watched happen with his own eyes. I was 2 blocks away when your father went to the meeting that was supposed to be his exit, the meeting that was arranged by the one person he trusted completely. The car hit a pothole. Nobody said anything for 3 seconds. Say the name, Dominic said. Mercer said it. Salvatore Vescari. The name sat in the back seat of the car like something with weight to it. Caruso's eyes went to the rearview mirror for a fraction of a second and then went back to the road. His knuckles didn't change on the steering wheel, but the muscles in his jaw did. Dominic breathed through his nose. Slow, controlled. The same way he breathed before every decision that couldn't be unmade. You're telling me my uncle killed my father. I'm telling you your uncle arranged for it. There's a difference, and it matters legally. Mercer reached into the canvas bag at their feet and produced a sealed binder. What I'm showing you right now is the financial trail. It won't feel like evidence of murder. It's going to feel like a corporate audit. He opened the binder to a tabbed page. But when you understand what these transfers mean, when you see the timeline of where money moved in the 48 hours before your father disappeared, you'll understand that Salvatore didn't just allow it to happen. He funded it. He structured it. He collected the proceeds. Dominic took the binder. He looked at the page. Numbers and dates and account codes. the language of money, which was a language he'd been fluent in since he was 14, and his uncle started teaching him how to read a balance sheet in a way that would never appear in any classroom. He understood what he was looking at within 60 seconds. The transfers were dated November 14th through November 16th, 1999. His father had disappeared on November 17th. 3 shell accounts he didn't recognize, not Vescari accounts, at least not any he'd been shown, had received significant deposits in those 48 hours. The deposits originated from a holding company he'd never heard of. The holding company was registered in Delaware. Its listed director was a name that meant nothing to him. He turned to the next tabbed page. The Delaware Holding Company's registered director was a pseudonym. The real beneficial owner, documented through 5 layers of corporate ownership that Mercer had apparently traced by hand over multiple years, was Salvatore Vescari. Dominic closed the binder. He set it on his knee and put both hands flat on it, the same way he'd put both hands flat on Mercer's counter an hour ago, and stared at the back of Caruso's seat. "He paid for it," Dominic said. "Yes. With money he then used to fund the expansion I led." "Yes. Which means every dollar I made for 15 years was built on the proceeds of your father's murder." "Yes." Mercer let him have the silence that followed. He didn't rush it. "I know what that feels like to hear." "No," Dominic said quietly. "You really don't." Caruso cleared his throat from the front seat. Dominic looked up. They were idling at a light on the edge of the Garfield warehouse district, the part of the city that looked abandoned but wasn't, the part where 3 of Dominic's storage operations ran under cover of derelict industrial facades. "We got a problem," Caruso said. He was looking at his phone, which had been buzzing intermittently for the past 5 minutes. "I'm getting calls from Petrov, from Denham, from both of the Richter brothers, all within the last 10 minutes. He paused. "Someone's putting out word that you've gone off the reservation, that you're compromised. The message is coming from Salvatore's office." Dominic looked at the time on the dashboard. 10:47 p.m. Salvatore had moved fast, faster than Dominic had calculated, which meant the men Salvatore sent to the grocery store weren't a precaution. They'd been pre-positioned, which meant Salvatore had known about tonight before tonight, which meant someone in Dominic's immediate circle had given him advance notice. He turned to Mercer. "Were you followed to the store tonight before I arrived?" Mercer shook his head. "I wasn't followed, but I was watched. There's a difference." He reached into the bag again and produced a small spiral notebook. "The gray Nissan parked on the corner of Aldrin and Reyes Street has been there for 11 days, rotating drivers. I have their schedules in here, the plate numbers, and 2 photographs I took from the second-floor window." Dominic stared at the notebook. "You've been under surveillance for 11 days, he said. "More like 14 months, if I'm being precise. But it intensified 11 days ago. And you didn't move the evidence." "Where would I move it?" Mercer said this without drama. "Wherever I went, they'd follow. The basement was safer than any vehicle or secondary location. And I needed you to come to me, not receive a package through intermediaries that your uncle might intercept." Dominic looked at him for a long moment. "You used the protection money demand as bait. You let my people come to you 3 times knowing eventually I'd come personally." Mercer didn't answer immediately. When he did, he kept his voice even. "Your father told me you were proud. He said if someone refused to pay you directly, you'd come yourself because you couldn't afford not to." He paused. "He knew you, even from the distance of a life you both never got to share." Something moved through Dominic's chest at that, fast and sharp, and immediately controlled. He pressed it down. Caruso's phone buzzed again. Caruso answered it, listened for 4 seconds, and said nothing before ending the call. He pulled the car to the curb and turned around. "Luca just called. Salvatore has called an emergency council meeting. All captains. Tonight, midnight, at the Garfield house." He held Dominic's gaze. "You're not on the invitation list." That was the clearest possible signal in the language of organizational politics. An emergency council, without the organization's head, wasn't an emergency council. It was a coup briefing. Dominic thought about the 11 captains who reported to him. He ran through each face in his mind, the ones whose loyalty he'd tested and confirmed, the ones whose loyalty he'd assumed, and the ones whose loyalty Salvatore had cultivated quietly over years, through gifts and favors and the patient investment of a man who'd been planning this for a very long time. He counted 5 he was certain of, 5 out of 11. "How far are we from the Garfield house?" he asked Caruso. 12 minutes. And from the communications relay at the Reyes Street facility? 8. Mercer had been listening. You're thinking about the communication network. I'm thinking about a lot of things. If you move on Salvatore tonight, directly, physically, you lose. He's had 15 years to build loyalty around himself that you didn't see because you weren't looking for it. You'd be walking into a room full of men who've already been told you're compromised. Mercer's voice was careful, but not soft. But if the evidence reaches those same men before you do, they hear it from me, it's a claim, Dominic said. They see it for themselves, it's a fact. He looked at the canvas bag on the floor. How fast can you make those recordings accessible? The financial evidence? Tonight. The recordings. There's one in particular you need to hear before anyone else does. Mercer reached into the bag and held up a single audio reel in a foam case. He'd labeled it by hand in that same cramped shorthand Dominic had seen on the journals downstairs. The label read only D from M, private, D for Dominic, M for Marco. His father's handwriting. He recognized it instantly from birthday cards and single-page notes left in jacket pockets that he'd kept in a box somewhere in his apartment for 43 years without ever throwing them away. He took the reel from Mercer's hand. It was lighter than he expected, small, the kind of ordinary object that becomes unbearable the moment you understand what it contains. What's on it? Dominic said. Your father recorded it 3 days before he disappeared, Mercer said. He recorded several, one for the federal unit, one for the internal evidence file, and one for you. He paused. He didn't know if you'd ever be in a position to hear it, but he made it anyway. Dominic looked at the reel, at his father's handwriting on the label. Outside the car, the rain had slowed to something quieter. The warehouse district was dark and still. Somewhere in this city, 11 captains were being driven toward midnight meeting at the Garfield house, where an old man with patient eyes and patient money was preparing to explain why the person they'd followed for 15 years could no longer be trusted. Dominic set the reel carefully on the seat beside him. Drive to the Reyes Street facility, he told Caruso. Use the back approach and kill the headlights on the last block. He looked at Mercer. You're going to show me how to push that financial data to a broadcast I can control. Mercer nodded once. And then, Dominic said, I'm going to listen to my father's voice for the first time in 25 years. Caruso pulled away from the curb. Nobody spoke for 2 minutes. The city moved past the windows, lit windows above dark storefronts, late-night figures under awnings, the ordinary life of a place that had no idea what was happening inside a white sedan on its streets. Dominic held the reel in both hands and looked at his father's handwriting and did not let himself feel anything yet because there was no room for it yet, and he'd learned that lesson the hard way before he was old enough to vote. But when the Reyes Street facility came into view, a low brick building behind a chain-link fence with a light on in the back office, and Caruso cut the headlights and the car rolled the last half block in near silence, Dominic noticed his hands were not entirely steady. He noticed it and said nothing, and kept moving. Inside the facility, the communications relay occupied a back room the size of a walk-in closet. Racks of equipment that routed encrypted messages through a private network that all of Iscari's captains were connected to, the system Dominic had commissioned 4 years ago for exactly this kind of operational security. He'd built it to protect the organization's communications from outside surveillance. He'd never imagined he'd one day use it to expose the organization's own foundations. Mercer looked at the equipment for 30 seconds, then at Dominic. This is a closed broadcast system? Captains receive on a dedicated frequency. Nobody outside the network can intercept it. But your uncle has access. So does everyone about to meet with him at midnight. Dominic checked his watch. 11:09, less than an hour. Which means they'll receive whatever we send before that meeting starts. Mercer set the canvas bag on the equipment table and began removing the binders. He worked with the methodical focus of someone who'd organized this material in their head 10,000 times. The financial records first, then the surveillance logs, then the corporate ownership chains. He talked while he worked, explaining what each piece was, what it proved, what it connected to. Dominic listened and absorbed and asked 3 questions. All 3 were about specifics, account numbers, dates, names, not about the larger narrative. He'd learned to work from specifics outward. The larger narrative could shift or be reframed. Specific numbers on specific dates and specific accounts were harder to argue with. By 11:34, Mercer had assembled a broadcast package. a compressed set of files that would transmit to every receiver on the network simultaneously. Financial documentation, ownership records, a timeline connecting Salvatore's movements in November 1999 to the events that followed. 47 pages of material that would take a careful reader approximately 2 hours to fully absorb. Every captain on the network would have it in front of them by 11:40. Dominic looked at the transmit button. He thought about the 5 captains he was certain of. He thought about the other 6, who were right now being driven towards Salvatore's version of the truth. He thought about what happened after you sent something like this. The chaos it would produce, the loyalties it would fracture, the violence that would follow from both directions before any of it resolved into something manageable. He pressed the button. The transmission took 40 seconds. A small indicator light went from red to green. Mercer exhaled, a long, controlled breath that had probably been building since they left the grocery store. Dominic turned to the reel-to-reel player that Caruso had already located in the facility's equipment room and carried in without being asked. He set his father's reel on the spindle, threaded the tape through the mechanism the way he'd watched his father do it on Sunday mornings, the memory of the motion in his hands, though he'd never done it himself. He pressed play. Static, then a slight hiss of old magnetic tape, then a voice. It was the voice of a man Dominic hadn't heard in 25 years. And it was immediately, unmistakably, the voice of his father. The particular cadence of it, the slight roughness at the lower register, the way certain vowels lengthened slightly when the speaker was choosing his words carefully. Dominic, a pause. If you're hearing this, then Elias found a way to get it to you, which means things went the way I was afraid they might. I'm not going to apologize for what I'm about to tell you because an apology doesn't carry enough weight for what I owe you. Dominic stood absolutely still. I built something I shouldn't have built. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd dismantle it before it got large enough to do the kind of damage it eventually did. I was wrong about the timeline. I was wrong about how fast it grows. And I was catastrophically wrong about who I trusted to stand beside me. The tape hissed. Dominic heard his father breathe, actually heard the breath, the physical reality of a man alive in a room, 25 years compressed into a moment of magnetic tape. Salvatore came to me 3 days ago and told me the federal unit had been compromised. He said my name was going to be used to burn everyone connected to the investigation. He offered to protect me if I agreed to walk away from the cooperation and come back fully into the organization. Another pause. I told him no. I want you to know that. I told him no. Caruso, standing in the doorway, wasn't looking at the equipment. He was looking at the floor. Mercer sat with his hands on the table, not moving. The empire was never supposed to be yours, son. I want that on record somewhere. You were supposed to build things. Legitimate things. The construction company, the import business, those were supposed to be yours. Not this. The voice tightened slightly. But if this is what you inherited, and if Salvatore is what built it after I was gone, then I need you to understand something. The only way to honor what I intended is not to maintain what he created. It's to end it. The tape ran for another 20 seconds in silence. Then his father's voice came back quieter. I don't know what age you are when you hear this. I don't know what you've done or what's been done in your name. But I know who you were at 9 years old, and that kid was worth protecting. A breath. I hope someone protected him. The tape ended. The reel spun freely for a moment, the loose end flapping against the housing in a small rhythmic sound. Dominic reached over and stopped it. He stood with his hand on the machine and the room was very quiet, and nobody said anything, and the small indicator light on the transmit unit had been green for 11 minutes, which meant 47 pages of financial documentation were sitting in the encrypted inboxes of 11 Viscari captains who were at this moment reading them on their phones in the backs of cars, headed toward a midnight meeting that was now fundamentally different from the meeting Salvatore had planned. Dominic's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Salvatore. He let it ring 4 times. Then he answered it, and before his uncle could speak, Dominic said quietly and clearly, I know everything. 3 seconds of silence on the line. Then Salvatore's voice, older than Dominic's father would be now, careful in the particular way of men who had spent decades being careful, said, Then you understand there's only one way this ends. And somewhere across the city, in a luxury high-rise whose legitimate corporate facade had laundered more money than most countries' GDP, A man who had spent 25 years building his nephew into the perfect instrument of his own ambition reached for a different phone and began making calls that would set the final act in motion before the night. Then you understand there's only one way this ends. Dominic stood with the phone against his ear and his father's voice still somewhere in the room. Not literally. The tape had stopped, but the way a sound lingers in a space after it's gone, the way a room holds the shape of something that was said in it. He could still hear that roughness in the lower register. He could still hear the breath between sentences. He focused. "Tell me how you think it ends," Dominic said. Salvatore didn't answer immediately. That pause, 2 seconds, maybe 3, told Dominic more than words would have. Salvatore was recalibrating. He'd expected panic or rage or the particular kind of fractured aggression that grief produces in men who haven't learned to manage it. He hadn't expected this tone. Controlled. Almost conversational. "You sent something to the network," Salvatore said. "I did." "That was a mistake." "We'll see." "Dominic?" The older man's voice shifted, not softer exactly, but more direct, the way it shifted in private meetings when Salvatore wanted something understood without the formality of organizational language. "You're holding documents assembled by a man you met 3 hours ago. A man who spent 20 years hiding in a grocery store. You don't know who he is. You don't know who sent him." Dominic looked at Mercer across the room. Mercer was watching him with those gray eyes and not pretending he couldn't hear both sides of the conversation. "I know exactly who he is," Dominic said. "Do you?" "Because I can tell you who he is. His name isn't Mercer. His name is Elias Vance, and he worked for a federal financial crimes unit that was compromised and shut down in 2001 after it was found to be operating outside its jurisdictional mandate. 2 of its senior investigators were indicted. Vance disappeared before he could testify." Another pause. "He's not a witness, Dominic. He's a fugitive. He's been building this story for 25 years because it's the only story that makes his disappearance look like heroism instead of cowardice." Dominic said nothing. "Come in," Salvatore said. "Come in tonight, sit down, and we go through this together. If there's something real in what he showed you, we look at it together. That's how your father would have handled it." "My father," Dominic said, "would have handled it differently for reasons you understand better than I do." Silence. "I'll be in touch," Dominic said, and ended the call. He set the phone down on the equipment table and stood with his hands flat on the surface and breathed through his nose. Once. Twice. He became aware of the hum of the equipment around him, the faint chemical smell of old electronics, the sound of rain resuming outside against the facility's high windows. He turned to Mercer. "Elias Vance." Mercer met his eyes. "That's my name, yes. Mercer is the name I've used for 20 years. The federal unit was shut down in 2001. "Yes." "Were you going to tell me that?" Mercer, Vance, held his gaze. "I was going to tell you everything in the right order so that you understood the context before you heard the parts that are easy to misread." He didn't look away. "What Salvatore just told you is accurate as far as it goes. The unit was shut down. 2 investigators were indicted. I disappeared before I could testify." He paused. "What he didn't tell you is why." "Then tell me." "The 2 investigators who were indicted because Salvatore's lawyers manufactured evidence against them. The jurisdictional case was built by the same legal team that has been handling Vescari organizational matters for 30 years. Vance stood up from the table, and for the first time since Dominic had met him, something moved in those gray eyes. Not anger exactly, but the particular intensity of a man who has kept something compressed for a very long time. "I disappeared because staying alive was the only way to keep the evidence intact. If I'd testified, I'd have been dead within a week and every document in that basement would have been seized and buried in a federal evidence archive for 60 years. Caruso, still in the doorway, shifted his weight. "Boss, it's 11:51. Dominic looked at his watch. 9 minutes to midnight. 11 captains arriving at the Garfield house. 47 pages of documentation sitting in their inboxes. "Have any of them called?" he asked Caruso. Caruso checked his phone. 3, Petrov, Denham, and Richter, the older one. All 3 called in the last 6 minutes. "What did they say?" "Petrov wants to know if it's real. Denham didn't leave a message. Richter said—" Caruso stopped. "What?" Richter said he's at the Garfield house and there are people there he doesn't recognize, not captains, not our people. Caruso looked up from the phone. He said there are approximately 20 armed men inside the building he's never seen before. Dominic took that information and placed it where it needed to go. 20 unfamiliar armed men at a location where his 11 captains were about to gather. That wasn't a council meeting. That was a controlled environment, a room from which nobody inconvenient was intended to leave. Salvatore hadn't been trying to reason with him on the phone. He'd been buying 4 minutes. Call Richter back, Dominic said. Tell him to get out of that building right now. Tell Petrov the same. Anyone who's received that broadcast and is currently at the Garfield house needs to leave before midnight. He looked at Caruso. Go. Make the calls outside. Caruso went. Dominic turned back to Vance. How many copies of the core evidence exist outside of what you were carrying tonight? The digital repository releases automatically if I miss my 72-hour check-in. It's distributed across 6 independent servers in 4 countries. Your uncle's people have located 2 of them. They haven't been able to access either one. And the originals, in the basement. Vance was quiet for a moment. I assume they're no longer in the basement. Dominic thought about the sound of the hatch opening above them, the men who'd come in after them. What would they do with the physical materials? Burn them, Vance said simply. It wouldn't destroy the digital copies, but it would eliminate the chain of custody. Without the originals, a defense lawyer could challenge the authenticity of everything we transmitted tonight. He paused. It weakens the case. Significantly. Dominic stood very still. Caruso came back through the door. His face had a quality Dominic recognized. The specific blankness of a man delivering information he doesn't want to deliver. Richter got out. He's clear. He stopped. Petrov didn't answer. Denham didn't answer. He looked at Dominic. I called 2 other numbers from the council list. Neither answered. 4 captains unreachable at midnight on a night when Salvatore had called an emergency meeting with 20 men nobody recognized. Dominic thought about 4 faces. 4 men he'd worked with, argued with, trusted within the specific and limited parameters of organizational loyalty. He thought about what a room with 20 armed strangers does to 4 men who walk into it expecting a council meeting. He turned away from Caruso and walked to the far wall of the equipment room. He stood there with one hand against the brick and looked at nothing for approximately 10 seconds. Then he turned around. We need to move the operation, he said. Everything in this room gets packed and relocated in the next 20 minutes. Vance, you're with me. Caruso, get 3 people you personally trust. Not people I trust, people you trust. And have them here in 15 minutes. Caruso nodded and pulled out his phone again. Vance was already beginning to pack the canvas bag. He worked quickly, the same efficient economy of motion he'd shown in the basement. Dominic watched him for a moment and thought about what Salvatore had said. 25 years building a story to make cowardice look like heroism. He thought about the reel of tape sitting on the spindle of the player. He thought about his father's breathing in the spaces between sentences. He picked up the reel and put it in the canvas bag himself. They were 40 minutes into their relocation. A second facility, 3 miles east, a legitimate fronted electronics repair business whose back rooms Dominic had never needed until now. When his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, he almost ignored it. Something made him open it. The message contained a single photograph. Dominic looked at the photograph for 4 seconds, and something happened to his face that Vance, watching from across the room, would later describe as the expression of a man watching the ground disappear under his feet. The photograph showed the interior of the Reyes Street facility, the equipment room they'd left 40 minutes ago. It was taken from the doorway, the angle slightly elevated, which meant it was taken by someone taller than average standing in the exact position Caruso had occupied for most of the night. Dominic looked at the photograph and then looked at Caruso, who was standing across the room giving instructions to the 3 men he'd called, and the geometry of what he was looking at rearranged itself into something he did not want it to be. He kept his face neutral. This was the most important thing he had done in the past 5 minutes, and it cost him more than anything he'd spent in the past 5 hours. He walked to the doorway of the back room and stood there until Caruso finished his sentence and looked over. Come here a second, Dominic said. Caruso came. He always came. In 15 years, he had always come when Dominic called him, which was, Dominic understood now, a data point he had fatally misread. Dominic showed him the photograph on the phone screen. Caruso looked at it. His face did something very small, a tightening around the eyes, immediately suppressed, that most people would have missed entirely. Dominic was not most people. "Somebody got into the facility after we left," Caruso said. His voice was steady. "Good. He was good at this, which was why he'd been good at it for 15 years without being caught." "Somebody got in fast," Dominic said. "We left 40 minutes ago. This photo is time-stamped 38 minutes ago." He kept his voice at a register that gave nothing away. 2 minutes after we cleared the building, before we even reached the highway. Maybe they were watching the building, followed us out, went back in. Maybe. Caruso met his eyes. The particular look of a man running calculations behind a steady expression. "You think it was someone with us?" "I think the photograph was sent to my personal phone," Dominic said. "Not the organizational line. My personal number, which approximately 6 people in this world have. Which means whoever sent it wanted me to know they had access. They wanted me to see this." He paused. "Why would someone want me to see this, Caruso?" Silence. The 3 men Caruso had called were in the next room. Dominic could hear them moving equipment, the sounds of ordinary work. Good men, probably. Or men who believed they were on the right side of what was happening tonight, which wasn't always the same thing. Caruso said, "I don't know." "Yes, you do," Dominic said. The air between them changed. Not dramatically. There was no moment of theatrical revelation. It changed the way air changes in a room when a window closes, a subtle shift in pressure that you feel before you consciously register it. "How long?" Dominic said. Caruso looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the floor. That was the answer. "How long?" Dominic said again, and this time his voice had something in it that had not been there before. Not rage, not grief, but the particular coldness of a man stripping away the last insulation between himself and an unacceptable fact. 8 months, Caruso said. He kept looking at the floor. "He came to me 8 months ago. He told me you were planning to dissolve the organization, scale it back, that the Mercer situation was already on your radar and you were using it as an exit strategy." He paused. "He told me you were going to sell out the captains to federal prosecutors to reduce your own exposure. And you believed him. I didn't know what to believe. I've been with you 15 years. He stopped, started again. He had documentation, records of meetings between your lawyers in a federal liaison office, dates, names. It looked real. It was manufactured, Dominic said. The same way he manufactured the case against the federal investigators in 2001. The same way he manufactured the story about the Carano family killing my father. He watched Caruso absorb that. You've been feeding him my movements for 8 months. Tonight, specifically, the grocery store, the tunnel, the Reyes Street facility, based on information you provided. Caruso said nothing. His jaw was working slightly, the movement of a man who has things to say and understands that none of them are going to help him. Vance had appeared in the doorway of the back room. He'd heard enough. He stood quietly, the canvas bag over one shoulder, and said nothing. Dominic looked at Caruso for a long moment. 15 years. He counted the things Caruso had done in 15 years. The problems he'd solved, the situations he'd navigated, the 3 times he had physically put himself between Dominic and something that would have ended Dominic's life. Real or theater, those moments. He'd never know now. Where are the men Salvatore sent to the grocery store tonight? Dominic said. Where did they go after we left through the tunnel? Back to the Garfield house, I think. I don't know specifically. Who led them? A man named Greco, external contractor. Salvatore uses him for operations he doesn't want traced to organizational personnel. Does Greco know about this facility? A pause that lasted 1 second too long. I mentioned it when I called in our location earlier. Dominic turned away from Caruso and looked at the wall. He breathed 3 times. He did the math on how long ago Caruso had made that call, and how long it would take a team moving with purpose to travel from the Garfield house to their current location, and the number he arrived at was not comfortable. He turned back. Get out, he said. Caruso looked up. What? Get out of this building, right now. Take your 3 men with you. Go wherever you need to go and stay out of my way. He kept his voice even. If you cross me again, if you do one more thing for Salvatore after you walk out that door, I will find out about it. You know I will. Caruso opened his mouth, closed it. You have about 30 seconds before I change my mind about the version of this where you walk out, Dominic said. Caruso left. He collected his 3 men from the back room with a word Dominic couldn't hear, and 40 seconds later the front door of the electronics shop opened and closed, and their footsteps diminished on the wet pavement outside. Vance walked into the room. He'll go to Salvatore, Vance said. Yes. Which means they'll know we're here. They probably already know. Caruso called in our location. Dominic moved to the window and looked at the street. Quiet, wet. A single streetlight reflected in a long puddle on the asphalt. How much time do you think we have? Vance checked his watch. 15 minutes. Maybe 20 if Greco's team is coming from the Garfield house. Then we use 15. Dominic turned from the window. His mind was moving in the particular way it moved under pressure. Not faster exactly, but more precisely. The unnecessary stripped away, each remaining thought load-bearing. The digital repository, the 6 servers. When it releases, automatically, when you miss your check-in, where does it release to? 4 independent investigative agencies. 2 federal, 2 international. The release is structured so that receipt confirmation from all 4 is required before the files can be suppressed. Any one of them receives it, the other 3 are automatically notified. How long before your next check-in? 61 hours. Can you trigger it manually, early release? Vance looked at him. Yes, but early release requires me to be physically present at a secure access point. There's one in the city. He paused. It's inside the Viscari Financial Tower. 14th floor, in what's listed as a server maintenance room for a legitimate data management company. He paused again. Your uncle's building. Dominic let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Of course it is, he said. Your father set it up. He wanted the access point somewhere Salvatore would never think to look for it. Somewhere so obvious, so completely inside the Empire's own infrastructure, that searching for it there would never occur to anyone. Vance's voice was steady. It's been sitting inside Salvatore's own building for 25 years. Dominic thought about the Viscari Financial Tower. 40 stories of glass and steel in the business district, legitimate corporate headquarters, the physical symbol of everything the Empire had laundered itself into. He'd been in that building hundreds of times. He knew its security layout, the cameras, the access points, the guard rotations, because he'd designed half of them. He also knew that after tonight, after the broadcast and Caruso's calls and Salvatore's phone and the 20 men at the Garfield house, that building was no longer a place Dominic Viscari could walk into without it being the last place he ever walked into. Unless he walked in as something different from what he'd been walking in as for 15 years. Not the heir, not the successor, not the man who maintained the empire. Something the building had never seen before. The man who came to end it. He picked up the canvas bag. He picked up the audio reel in its foam case and placed it carefully in the front pocket of the bag. He looked at Vance. Can you walk 2 miles? He said. Vance looked at him steadily. I've been walking 25 years. 2 miles is nothing. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street was quiet. But 3 blocks to the south, if Dominic had been standing at the right window, he would have seen headlights. 2 sets, then a third, moving through the wet dark with the deliberate pace of vehicles that know exactly where they're going. He didn't see them. He and Vance were already out the back door and into the alley, moving east through the silence of a city that was about to wake up to something it had no language for yet, carrying a canvas bag and an old audio reel and 47 pages of the truth. And ahead of them, rising above the downtown skyline in its full, illuminated corporate authority, the glass tower that held the one switch that could bring all of it down stood waiting, indifferent and enormous. In the last quiet hour before everything changed, Dominic looked at it as they emerged from the alley onto an open street, and for the first time in 43 years he felt the specific sensation of walking toward something without any version of a plan that guaranteed he would walk back out. He kept walking, because the alternative, the thing on the other side of stopping, the thing that happened if he turned around or went to ground or tried to negotiate his way into a survival that Salvatore would define the terms of, was a life built on a lie that had already consumed 25 years and 4 men who hadn't deserved what happened to them. And Dominic Viscari had spent 15 years deciding who deserved what, and he was done with that particular form of authority. The tower was 6 blocks away. They walked. And in a penthouse office 40 stories above the street, a phone rang, and a man who had spent 25 years being patient picked it up, listened for 11 seconds, and said to the room around him, to the 3 people in that room who had earned the right to hear what happened next, "He's moving toward the tower." A pause. "Let him come." The Viscari Financial Tower had 40 floors of glass and reinforced steel and a lobby that cost more to build than most hospitals. Dominic had walked through its front entrance 200 times. He knew the security desk layout, the camera blind spots, the elevator override codes, and the guard rotation schedule down to the 15-minute intervals. He also knew that every single one of those advantages had been reported to Salvatore through Caruso over the past 8 months. So he went in through the parking structure on the south side. The service entrance was a steel door set into the concrete wall of the second basement level, accessible with a maintenance code that Dominic had assigned to a facilities contractor 18 months ago and never updated. He punched in the 6 digits and held his breath for 2 seconds. The lock disengaged. He let the breath out. Vance came through behind him, and Dominic eased the door shut without letting it click. The corridor beyond was low-ceilinged and fluorescent lit, smelling of machine oil and concrete dust. Pipes ran along the ceiling. The floor was painted gray, scuffed to bare concrete in the center where foot traffic had worn through the paint over years. Vance put his mouth close to Dominic's ear. 14th floor, north side. Room labeled MT4 on the building schematic. It looks like a utility closet from the outside. Dominic nodded. He checked the phone in his jacket pocket. Still on, screen dimmed to minimum brightness. 1:17 a.m. The building's skeleton crew at this hour would be a lobby guard, 1 roving security officer covering floors 2 through 20, and 2 men on the executive floors above 30. Standard configuration for overnight operations. That was the configuration he'd designed. What he didn't know was what Salvatore had added tonight. They moved down the service corridor toward the freight elevator. Dominic kept one hand on the wall, not for balance, but for orientation. The muscle memory of a man who knew this building the way you know a house you grew up in your hands and feet before your eyes. The freight elevator was at the far end, a heavy industrial unit with a gate that had to be pulled manually. He stopped before they reached it. Voices. Ahead of them, around the bend in the corridor, where it turned toward the loading dock. 2 men, talking at a volume that said they weren't trying to be quiet, which meant they were men who'd been told they were the last line and had been waiting long enough to get comfortable. Dominic pressed himself against the wall and turned to look at Vance. Vance had already stopped. His breathing was controlled. The man had genuinely been through this before, or something close enough to it that his body remembered what to do. Dominic listened to the voices for 30 seconds. 2 distinct registers. 1 lower, 1 with a slight accent he placed as Eastern European. They were talking about a football game. Neither of them was paying attention to the corridor. He looked around the bend corner by centimeter. 2 men, dressed in the same uniform as Viscari Financial's contracted security. Gray jacket, dark trousers, radio clipped to the shoulder. But with the build and posture of men whose actual profession was not security. They stood near the loading dock door, coffees in hand. One was leaning against the wall, the other was facing away. Dominic pulled back. He looked at Vance and held up 2 fingers. Vance understood. Dominic pointed to himself, then to the man leaning against the wall. He pointed to Vance, then held up 1 hand flat. Stay. Vance shook his head slightly. Dominic gave him a look that ended the conversation. He moved around the corner. He covered the distance in 8 steps, fast and silent on the concrete, closing the gap before either man's peripheral vision had time to process the movement. The man leaning against the wall registered him first, eyes going wide, mouth starting to open. And Dominic hit him with a forearm across the throat, not a punch, a controlled compression that collapsed the voice before it could become a sound. The man went down against the wall, gagging. The second man turned and had his hand on his radio before Dominic was on him, grabbing the radio hand and twisting it behind and up until the angle made the man's knees buckle, then driving him face first into the concrete wall hard enough to end the encounter without ending the man. Both of them were down in 11 seconds. Dominic's breathing was elevated. His left shoulder ached from the impact, an old rotator cuff issue that had never properly healed flaring up with the muscle memory of complaint. He ignored it. He took both radios, pocketed one, held the other up, and listened. Chatter. Organized, clipped, professional. At least 4 other voices on the channel doing position check-ins. He counted the voices and the intervals and estimated 8 additional people in the building beyond the standard overnight crew. He went back and got Vance. The freight elevator took them to the 13th floor. He avoided 14 directly, not wanting the doors to open onto whatever was waiting there, and they went up the remaining level through the service stairwell. The door onto the 14th floor was steel with a wire mesh window. Dominic looked through it for 30 seconds before touching the handle. The corridor was empty. Institutional carpet, low lighting set to overnight mode, the soft ambient hum of a building's electrical systems. Doors on both sides. He counted from the stairwell door. MT4 would be 6 doors down on the right, according to the schematic Vance had described. He eased the door open and they moved into the corridor. 4 doors down, a door that should have been unremarkable, should have been a utility closet, should have looked like every other door on this floor, was slightly ajar, a thin line of light visible at the edge. Someone was already in there. Dominic stopped. He felt Vance stop behind him. He thought very fast. Salvatore had said, "Let him come." He'd meant it. Which meant whoever was in that room was there by design, not coincidence. Which meant going through that door meant walking into something pre-arranged. He had 2 options. Walk into it or don't. Not going in meant 61 hours before the automatic release triggered. 61 hours during which Salvatore had full operational freedom to do whatever he needed to do to the remaining captains, the remaining evidence chains, the remaining people who might testify or corroborate or simply remember things inconveniently. 61 hours was enough time to bury everything twice. He walked to the door and pushed it open. The room was larger than a utility closet. It had been built to look like one from the corridor. The door, the external signage, but inside it was roughly the size of a small office. Server racks along 2 walls, a workstation with a monitor displaying a login prompt, cable management running up the walls in organized bundles, and Caruso, sitting on a folding chair in the center of the room with his hands folded in his lap, looking exactly like a man who had agreed to be here. Beside him, standing, a man Dominic didn't recognize. Late 40s, compact build, the kind of stillness that comes from professional training. No jacket. He'd already placed his weapon on the edge of the workstation where Dominic could see it, a gesture of controlled confidence. Greco, Dominic understood. The external contractor. "He said you'd come straight here," Caruso said. He wasn't looking at Dominic. He was looking at the floor, which was the second time tonight he'd looked at the floor when he should have been looking at Dominic's face. "He said you'd figure out the access point before you figured out that coming here was exactly what he needed you to do." "Why did he need me here?" Dominic said. Greco answered. His voice was flat and accented slightly, not Eastern European, something further south. "Because the access point requires biometric confirmation from an authorized organizational administrator. Fingerprint and retinal." He gestured at the workstation. "Mr. Vescari Sr. is authorized. So are you." He paused. But the system was designed to require confirmation from both. One administrator can initiate the early release. A second must confirm it. Your father built in a 2-key requirement. Dominic looked at the workstation, then at Greco. "Salvatore can't trigger it alone." "He's been trying to for 6 years, Greco said. Tonight he decided to try a different approach. Dominic understood the geometry of what he was standing in. Salvatore needed him alive and functional to trigger the release, and then needed to control what happened after the trigger, direct the release to destinations of his choosing, rather than the 4 independent agencies Vance had specified. Redirect 25 years of evidence into a controlled burn instead of a public exposure. Salvatore had spent 6 years trying to find and dismantle the system remotely. Tonight he'd decided to use the one key he couldn't manufacture, his nephew. "Where is he?" Dominic said. 40th floor, Greco said. "He'd like you to come up." "I'm sure he would." "Mr. Vescari." Greco's voice stayed flat, unhurried. "You came here to trigger the release. Your uncle wants to discuss the terms of how that release is structured. It's a conversation. Whatever you think of him, he's offering you that. He paused. The alternative is this room, tonight, which is a situation I think you're experienced enough to read accurately. Dominic looked at Caruso again. Caruso had finally looked up. His face had the quality of a man sitting inside a decision he'd already made and couldn't unmake, which was a quality Dominic knew from the inside. "Is this your choice?" Dominic asked him. "Sitting in that chair? Is this where you decided to end up?" Caruso said nothing. Dominic looked at Vance. Vance was looking at the server racks with the focused attention of a man doing mathematics in his head. "The workstation," Vance said quietly. "The login prompt. If you initiate the sequence..." Greco moved, fast. The kind of fast that confirmed what the stillness had already suggested, covering the distance to Vance in 2 steps and putting a hand on his shoulder that was not gentle. "Don't." Vance stopped talking. Dominic looked at Greco's hand on Vance's shoulder. He looked at the weapon on the workstation edge. He looked at Caruso in the folding chair. He measured all of it in the span of a breath. He walked to the workstation. Greco half-turned, keeping his hand on Vance. "What are you—" "I'm going to log in," Dominic said. He sat down at the workstation with the deliberate calm of a man sitting down to sign a document. "Because this system requires 2 administrators. If I initiate the sequence here, Salvatore has to come to me to complete it." He looked at the login prompt, then at Greco. "Tell him I'll be waiting." Greco stared at him. "Tell him," Dominic said, "that if he wants to control the release, he needs to be in this room within 20 minutes or the system times out and defaults to the automatic schedule." He had no idea if that was true. He said it with the absolute certainty of a man who'd been lying convincingly since before he was old enough to shave. Greco took out his phone. While Greco made the call, Dominic's fingers rested on the keyboard. He looked at the login prompt and thought about his father building this system. Building it inside Salvatore's own building, inside the Empire's own infrastructure. The terminal hidden in plain sight for 25 years. The patience of that. The particular faith that someone would eventually find the right door. He thought about a 9-year-old kid his father had believed was worth protecting. He put his thumbprint on the biometric reader. The system beeped once, and the login prompt shifted, asking for retinal confirmation. He leaned into the retinal scanner mounted beside the monitor. A soft red light swept across his eye. The screen changed. A new interface appeared. Older design, the kind of interface built in the late 90s when this system was created. Simple, text-based. A single prompt. Initiate early release sequence, Y/N. Below it, a note. Confirmation required from second authorized administrator. Dominic typed Y. The screen responded, sequence initiated, awaiting second administrator confirmation, timeout in 45 minutes. 45 minutes. He'd said 20. Close enough. Greco finished his call and looked at him. Something had shifted in Greco's expression. Not concern, exactly, but the recalibration of a professional who'd been handed a situation with more variables than he'd been briefed on. "He's coming down?" "Good," Dominic said. He turned in the chair to face the room. "Then we wait." The 45-minute countdown ran in the corner of the screen in a small digital display. Dominic could see it without appearing to watch it. 44:37. 44:36. Each second with its own weight. Caruso stood up from the folding chair. "Sit down," Greco said without looking at him. Caruso sat down. Vance, still with Greco's hand on his shoulder, though it had loosened from grip to presence, caught Dominic's eye. The gray eyes were doing the thing they'd been doing since the grocery store. Steady, processing, running long calculations behind a face that gave nothing away to anyone who didn't know what to look for. He gave a fractional nod. Barely visible. Dominic understood. Whatever Vance had seen in those server racks, whatever mathematics he'd been running in his head, there was something here that Dominic didn't fully know about yet. He filed it. 11 minutes later, the elevator at the end of the corridor made the soft sound of arrival. Footsteps. Multiple sets, 4 at least, the deliberate cadence of an escort, moved down the hall. The door opened. Salvatore Vescari was 71 years old and looked 60. He was a smaller man than his presence suggested, 5'9", lean, with a full head of white hair kept very short and eyes that were the same deep brown as Dominic's father, in the one photograph Dominic still carried in his wallet. The family resemblance was obvious and had always made Dominic slightly uncomfortable in a way he'd never examined until tonight. He wore a dark suit, no tie. He moved into the room with the ease of a man entering a room he owns, which he did because he did, and the two men behind him took positions near the door with the trained invisibility of people paid not to be noticed. Salvatore looked at the workstation screen, at the countdown. 33, 12. He looked at Dominic. "You look like your father," he said. Not warmly, not cruelly, just as a fact stated plainly, the way you'd note the weather. "So people tell me," Dominic said. Salvatore moved to the center of the room. He looked at Vance. He looked at Vance for a long moment, the look of a man seeing something he'd spent years searching for, and said nothing. Then he looked back at Dominic. "Do you know what that system releases?" 25 years of financial evidence, Dominic said, to 4 agencies, 2 federal, 2 international. Salvatore clasped his hands behind his back. "What it also releases, what Vance hasn't told you, because he either doesn't know or has chosen not to, is a complete operational record of every cooperation agreement your father made with those federal agencies, including the names of every person who provided information in exchange for immunity." He paused. 12 names. People still alive. People who have spent 25 years living under the assumption that those records were destroyed. Dominic kept his face still. "The moment that system releases to those agencies," Salvatore continued, "those 12 names become part of a federal case file, which means they become discoverable, which means every defense lawyer connected to anyone indicted on the basis of that evidence will subpoena those names." He let that sit for 2 full seconds. "Your father didn't know that when he built the system. The law changed in 2003. The release protocol was never updated." Dominic looked at Vance. Vance's face had done something, small, controlled, but real. The compression around the mouth of a man receiving information that reconfigures something he believed was settled. "Is that true?" Dominic said. Vance was quiet for 3 seconds. "The 2003 amendment to Federal Discovery Protocol. I knew about it." Another second. "I didn't know the release file included the cooperation records. Your father told me those were in a separate archive." His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him something. "If they're embedded in the main release package—" "They are," Salvatore said. "I found them 6 years ago when I first located the system. I've known what a full release would expose since then." He looked at Dominic. "Which is why I've never triggered it. Which is why I've spent 6 years trying to find a way to extract those 12 names before the release, not to bury the financial evidence." He paused. "I want the organization dismantled, Dominic. I've wanted it dismantled for 10 years. It's too expensive, too visible, too dangerous in this regulatory environment." He said it with the flat pragmatism of a man discussing inventory. "But not at the cost of 12 people who trusted your father's word." The countdown on the screen read 29:44. Dominic sat in the chair and looked at his uncle. At this man who had murdered his father, who had engineered his entire life, who had converted grief into a 15-year loyalty that had served Salvatore's interests with perfect efficiency, and tried to locate the place where that truth and this new information existed in the same space without one of them collapsing. "You killed him," Dominic said. His voice was quiet. "Nothing you say about those 12 names changes that." "No," Salvatore said. "It doesn't." "Then why are you telling me?" "Because you're about to make a decision that affects people who had nothing to do with what happened between me and your father. People who made an agreement with a federal agency in good faith and have been living with the consequences of that agreement for 25 years. He took 1 step closer to the workstation. "I'm asking you to let me sit down at that machine and extract those records before you confirm the release. 10 minutes. Then you confirm it, and I walk out of this room and into whatever comes next." "Pui? Mats." Dominic looked at the screen, 28:51. He looked at Vance. "Can you verify whether the cooperation records are embedded in the release package?" Vance moved to the workstation. Greco led him, which meant Greco had received a signal Dominic hadn't seen, and his fingers moved across the keyboard with the speed of a man who'd built this system's predecessor and understood its architecture. 30 seconds. A minute. Vance stopped typing. He turned around. His face was the face of a man delivering news he had not prepared himself to deliver. "They're there," he said, "embedded in the primary release file. I don't know how they got there. Your father may have included them intentionally as insurance, a way to ensure the release would be taken seriously rather than buried. Or the file was modified after the fact." He looked at Dominic. "Either way, a full release exposes them." 29 seconds of silence. The countdown read 27:03. Dominic stood up from the chair. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the screen and looked at his uncle and looked at the door and thought about 12 people who'd made an agreement with a dead man in 1999 and had been living inside the terms of that agreement for 25 years, in houses and cities and lives that were built on the assumption that a certain set of records no longer existed. He thought about his father's voice on the tape, the breath between sentences. He thought about what it meant to honor an intention without knowing every consequence of the action it required. Salvatore sat down at the workstation. He looked at Dominic with a question on his face that he didn't speak aloud because he'd spent 71 years understanding that asking permission in a moment like this was the wrong kind of weakness. Dominic said, "If you touch that keyboard before I tell you to, I pull the power on every rack in this room and we go back to the automatic schedule and the 12 names take their chances." Salvatore pulled his hands back from the keyboard. "Vance," Dominic said, "can you isolate the cooperation file from the release package?" Vance looked at the screen. "Technically, yes. It would take how long?" 18 minutes, maybe 15. Dominic looked at the countdown. 26:19. "You have 14, he said. "Start." Vance moved to the keyboard, and Salvatore stood up and moved back, and the two of them exchanged a look that contained 25 years of everything. The evidence and the absence and the murdered man and the grocery store and the tape reel and the 9-year-old kid who'd been worth protecting. And neither of them said anything, because there was nothing in the available language that was adequate to the moment, and both of them knew it. Vance typed. The server racks hummed, the countdown moved, and in the corridor outside the room, beyond the two men at the door, the elevator made its soft sound again. Arriving, not departing. And Dominic turned his head toward the door, and the particular quality of the silence that followed the elevator's arrival told him, before the door opened, before he saw anything, that whatever he'd been calculating had just changed, because the men at the door had gone very still in the specific way that men go still when they recognize the sound of something that was not in the briefing. The door opened. Richter stood in the corridor. Behind him, Petrov. Behind them, 3 other faces Dominic recognized. Captains, men who'd received the broadcast, men who'd read 47 pages of financial documentation in the backs of cars headed toward the Garfield house and made a decision about what they were going to do about it before they arrived. Richter looked at Dominic. He looked at Salvatore. He looked at the 2 men at the door who looked back at him, and the math in the room changed irrevocably in the span of that 3-way look. "We got your broadcast," Richter said. His voice was rough, a big man's voice made rougher by a night of driving and deciding. He looked at Dominic. "All of us. Every captain on the network." "How many?" Dominic said. 7. "The other 4... Richter stopped. His jaw tightened. "The other 4 were already inside the Garfield house when we got the message out." Dominic didn't ask what that meant. He already knew what it meant, and the knowledge sat in his chest like something structural failing under too much weight. And he breathed through it because there was nothing else to do with it right now. And the countdown on the screen behind him read 1941. And Vance was still typing, and Salvatore stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and his white hair and his dead brother's eyes. And somewhere in this city, the sun was 4 hours away from rising on a world that was going to be fundamentally different from the one that had gone to sleep. And Dominic Viscari, who had spent 43 years becoming exactly what one man's grief and another man's ambition had required him to become, stood in a server room on the 14th floor of his own building and understood, with the specific clarity that only arrives when every possible alternative has been removed, that the version of himself that walked out of this room was not going to resemble the version that had walked in. The countdown read 1902. Vance's fingers moved across the keyboard without stopping. Salvatore looked at Dominic and said very quietly, so that only Dominic could hear it. "Whatever you decide in the next 19 minutes, whatever you think of me, whatever I deserve, finish it cleanly." Your father would have wanted it finished cleanly. Dominic looked at him. My father, he said, just as quietly, would have wanted it finished. The countdown read 1902 when Vance stopped typing. Not because he'd finished, because his hands had stopped moving, and the reason his hands had stopped moving was that the screen in front of him had changed. Not from anything he'd done, but from a remote input that arrived through the system's administrative backdoor. A channel that shouldn't have been accessible from outside this room. A channel that existed because someone had built it in, years ago, against exactly this kind of moment. Vance stared at the screen. Someone's in the system, he said. His voice had no panic in it, just the flat recognition of a man identifying a technical fact. External access, administrator level. Dominic moved to the workstation in 2 steps. The screen showed an active session, a second cursor moving through the file directory with the confident navigation of someone who knew the architecture. Not probing, not searching, moving directly, the way you move through a system you built. Can you lock them out? Dominic said. I'm trying. Vance's hands were moving again, pulling up access control panels, attempting to revoke the external session's permissions. The other cursor kept moving. They're ahead of me. Whatever they're doing, they prepared for this specifically. Dominic looked at Salvatore. Salvatore was watching the screen with an expression that was not the expression of a man who had done this. It was the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't planned, which on Salvatore's face was a rare enough event that Dominic had learned to recognize it over 43 years of intermittent observation. This isn't you, Dominic said. No, Salvatore said, simply, without elaboration. Richter moved into the room from the doorway. What's happening? Someone else is in the system, Dominic said. He looked at the screen, at the external cursor navigating the file tree, and tried to work out the logic of who had the access, the knowledge, and the motivation to do this right now, at this specific moment, during the 19-minute window between initiation and confirmation. The external cursor stopped moving. A new prompt appeared on screen. Cooperation records extraction complete. File isolated. Release package updated. Proceed with confirmation? Vance read it twice. He turned around slowly. Someone just did what I was trying to do. From outside. They pulled the cooperation records out of the release package. He paused. The release is clean. It's just the financial evidence now. The 12 names are isolated. The room was quiet for 3 seconds. Who? Dominic said. Vance shook his head. He looked genuinely uncertain, which was not an expression that sat naturally on his face. He turned back to the screen and pulled up the session log, tracking the external access back through its routing. He followed it for 30 seconds through layers of anonymized relay nodes, and then stopped at a server address that made him go very still. This access came from an account registered to the Federal Financial Crimes Unit, he said, the one that was shut down in 2001. He turned around again. Someone in that unit has been maintaining system access for 25 years. Someone who knew about this terminal. Someone who knew tonight was going to happen. Dominic looked at the isolated file on the screen. 12 names secured. The release package clean. He thought about his father, about a man who'd built a 2-key system with a backdoor that could isolate specific files, about the kind of person who thinks that far ahead, who builds not just one contingency but layers of them, nested inside each other like rooms inside rooms, each one accounting for a failure mode the previous one couldn't handle. He thought about how much his father had loved him, and how that love had expressed itself not in presence, but in architecture. In systems built to protect something across decades, in a reel of tape kept by a quiet man in a grocery store, in the specific faith that the right person would eventually find the right door. He sat down at the workstation. He put his thumb on the biometric reader. He looked at Salvatore. Sit down. Salvatore sat. When I confirm this release, Dominic said, it goes to 4 agencies. The cooperation records don't go anywhere. They stay isolated in a file that you and I are going to agree, right now, gets handed directly to a federal victims advocate with instructions to notify those 12 people personally before any legal proceedings begin. They get the chance to prepare. He paused. After that, you call your lawyers and you tell them you're cooperating fully. Not a negotiated cooperation, full. Salvatore looked at him for a long moment. And you? Same. You'll be prosecuted. Yes. Everything you've built, Wasn't mine, Dominic said. It was built on your money and my father's name and the work of people who are dead because of decisions made in this organization. I've known that for about 6 hours, and I'm still processing the dimensions of it. But the one thing I know clearly is that I'm not interested in protecting any piece of it. He held his uncle's gaze. Are we agreed? Salvatore looked at the screen, at the countdown which read 1417, at the file directory showing the isolated cooperation records, at the clean release package waiting for a second thumbprint. We're agreed, he said. He leaned forward and placed his thumb on the reader. The screen processed for 3 seconds. Then, second administrator confirmed, initiating release, estimated transmission complete, 4 minutes. The server racks behind them changed their hum, a slight deepening of pitch, the sound of significant data moving. Richter, standing in the doorway, watched the racks with the expression of a man watching something he understands only in outline, but understands enough. The 4 minutes passed in silence. When the transmission complete notification appeared, Vance exhaled, a long, slow breath that he'd probably been holding in various forms for 25 years, compressed and stored, and finally released in a server room on the 14th floor of a building he'd never been inside before tonight. He sat down on the floor against the wall, the canvas bag beside him, and put his hands on his knees and looked at the ceiling. Dominic looked at the screen for another moment. Then he took out his phone. He called a number he'd memorized 18 months ago and never used. The direct line of a federal financial crimes prosecutor named Hargrove, whom he'd had thoroughly investigated at the time and concluded was the least corruptible member of the relevant federal apparatus. He'd kept the number because in some version of himself that he hadn't fully acknowledged, he'd known this moment was going to come. The call connected on the 4th ring. A woman's voice, groggy with sleep, disrupted at 2 a.m. This is Dominic Vescari, he said. You've received a file transmission in the last 4 minutes. I'm calling to confirm its authenticity and to tell you I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation that follows. I'm also calling to tell you that among the materials you'll find is a cooperation records file that needs to be handled through victim advocacy before it enters any proceeding. I need that committed to before I say anything else. A silence on the line. Then Hargrove's voice, sharper now, the sleep gone out of it. Mr. Viscari, are you in a secure location? Relatively. I'm going to need you to come in. I know, I'll come in at 9 a.m. with a lawyer. Before that, I need the commitment on the cooperation records. Another silence. He heard her moving, heard the sound of a laptop opening. I'm looking at the transmission now. A pause. This is a significant file. Yes. The cooperation records file. Is it clearly labeled? It's isolated from the main package, separate file, clearly labeled, 12 individuals. He paused. Some of them may not know they're in there. They need to be notified directly before any defense team gets access. Hargrove was quiet for 8 seconds. He counted them. I can make that commitment for my office. Cross-agency, I'll need to make calls. Make them, Dominic said. I'll see you at 9. He ended the call. He stood in the server room on the 14th floor with 7 criminal organization captains, an elderly forensic accountant sitting on the floor, and his uncle, the man who had murdered his father and built him into the instrument of that murder's continuation. And the hum of the server racks was already quieting back to its normal register, the data gone. The 25 years of accumulated truth now sitting in 4 separate inboxes on 4 separate continents, past the point of retrieval or suppression or any of the mechanisms that had kept it contained since 1999. It was done. The next 4 hours were not clean. They never were. Salvatore's 2 men at the door had to be reasoned with. Richter handled that, in the particular way that a large man with a direct manner handles situations that don't respond well to nuance. One of them cooperated immediately. The other required a conversation. By 2:40 a.m., both of them were sitting in the corridor with their weapons on the floor and their phones on the floor beside the weapons, and Dominic had called a lawyer he trusted, one whose relationship with him was old enough to predate Salvatore's influence, and given instructions for what the morning needed to look like. Greco, who had been professionally cooperative since the moment Richter walked in with numbers that changed the room's math, sat quietly near the workstation and said very little. He was a contractor. Contractors adapted to outcomes. He asked once whether his cooperation would be noted, And Dominic told him that was between Greco and the federal prosecutors, and Greco nodded and returned to his quiet. Caruso was the hardest part of the night. He was still in the folding chair when Dominic finally came back to him, after the calls, after the arrangements, after the 7 captains had been given their instructions, and Vance had been settled into a situation where he was no longer anyone's immediate problem. Caruso sat in the folding chair with his hands folded in his lap, the same way they'd been folded when Dominic walked in, and he looked up when Dominic stopped in front of him, and whatever he saw in Dominic's face made his own face do something complicated and involuntary. 8 months? Dominic said. He wasn't accusing, he was just stating the number, the way you state a distance. Yes. What did he promise you? Caruso looked at his hands. Continuity. A piece of the legitimate operations after the restructure. He said you were planning to walk away and leave everyone exposed. He said he'd protect the people who helped him manage the transition. He paused. It sounded like what you'd have told me if our positions were reversed. Because he built it to sound that way. I know that now. Dominic sat down on the edge of the workstation and looked at Caruso for a long time. 15 years. The 3 times he'd put himself between Dominic and something that would have ended Dominic. Real or theater, he'd said earlier. He still didn't know. He wondered if Caruso knew. Did you ever actually try to protect me? Dominic said. Any of those times? Or was that also part of it? Caruso looked up. His eyes were red at the edges in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Every time, he said. Whatever else I did, every time someone came for you, that was real. He held Dominic's gaze. I need you to know that. I don't know why I need you to know it, but I do. Dominic looked at him for another long moment. Go home, he said. In the morning, call Hargrove's office. They'll have your name by then. How it goes from there is between you and them. Caruso stood. He stood slowly, like a man whose body had absorbed a night's worth of things it hadn't been built to absorb. He looked at Dominic once more, and then he walked out of the room, and his footsteps went down the corridor and into the elevator and were gone. Dominic sat on the edge of the workstation and listened to the quiet. Vance appeared in the doorway. He'd gotten up off the floor at some point, retrieved the canvas bag, straightened his flannel shirt. He looked, in the flat institutional light of the corridor, exactly like what he was. A 60-year-old man at the end of a very long road that had started in someone else's story and become his own without him ever quite choosing it. The automatic check-in, Dominic said. Your 72-hour window. It doesn't matter now. No, Vance said. It doesn't. You can stop running the clock. Vance looked at him. It's been a habit for 25 years. It'll take some time to stop. Dominic almost said something, then he didn't. Some things didn't need the full sentence. They left the building together at 3:15 a.m., through the same service entrance they'd come in through. The parking structure was quiet. The city beyond it was in that particular late-night stillness that precedes the first delivery trucks and the first gray light. The stillness that belongs only to the hours between when the last people go to sleep and before the first ones wake up. Dominic stood on the sidewalk outside the structure and breathed the cold air. His shoulder ached. His left hand, which had taken impact during the encounter in the service corridor, was swollen along 2 knuckles and would be properly painful by morning. He was aware of a tiredness that lived below muscle and bone, the kind that comes from the body finally being allowed to register what it's been carrying. He looked at the city, at the buildings, most of them dark, a few lit on upper floors where someone was working late or couldn't sleep. He'd looked at this city from a position of ownership for 15 years. The particular way you look at something you believe you control, which is never really looking at it at all. He looked at it now without that lens, and it was larger than he remembered. More indifferent. More itself. Vance stood beside him. He was looking at the same city, or his version of it. The city he'd lived in for 25 years as a man nobody saw. A man who sold candy to children and coffee to elderly neighbors and repaired broken radios on a bench that smelled like old solder and kept a 25-year secret in a stone basement under a wooden floor. What will you do? Dominic said. After. Vance was quiet for a moment. Go back to the store, if it's still standing. It might not be. Then I'll find another one. He said it without drama. I'm good at starting from a small thing and waiting. Dominic looked at him. 25 years is a long time to wait. It is. Vance picked up the canvas bag's strap and settled it on his shoulder. But the alternative was letting it all disappear. The evidence, the truth, the thing your father died trying to do. He paused. Some things are worth the waiting, not because the waiting is noble, because the thing at the end of it is real, and the person who needs it eventually shows up. Dominic said nothing for a moment. He knew I'd show up, he said. My father. He knew. He hoped, Vance said. He looked at Dominic steadily. There's a difference. He hoped. He built systems to make it possible. He left you a recording he didn't know you'd ever hear. He paused. The rest of it was you. They stood on the sidewalk for another minute, two men who had arrived at the same place by routes so different that the only thing connecting them was one man's decision, 25 years ago, to trust another man with the truth and ask him to hold it for a son who might never come. Then Vance turned and walked east, the canvas bag over one shoulder, his pace unhurried and steady, the pace of a man who had somewhere to be and no reason to rush to it. He didn't look back. Dominic watched him until he turned a corner and was gone. The months that followed were not a resolution so much as a reckoning, a long, grinding institutional process that had none of the finality of a single night's decision and all of the consequences of it. The federal investigation that opened on the basis of Vance's files ultimately produced indictments across 4 states and 2 countries. 41 individuals were charged, 19 ultimately convicted. The charges ranged from money laundering and racketeering to obstruction and financial fraud. Several of the names were names that had appeared in newspapers for years as pillars of the legitimate business community. Executives, a city councilman, a retired federal judge who'd been drawing a Viscari supplemental income since before Dominic was born. Salvatore Viscari pleaded guilty to a negotiated set of charges that included conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and financial crimes. He was 71 years old, and his lawyers negotiated aggressively, and he received a sentence that his age and health made partly theoretical. He served his time in a minimum security facility and said nothing publicly that contradicted what he'd agreed to in the 14th floor server room at 2 a.m. on an October night. The 4 men who hadn't made it out of the Garfield house became part of a separate investigation. 3 of Greco's external contractors were charged in connection with what happened there. The investigation into those events was ongoing for nearly 2 years. Dominic cooperated with prosecutors from the morning after, as he'd said he would. His cooperation was comprehensive. Names, accounts, operational structures, the full architecture of 15 years of organizational management laid out in deposition rooms and grand jury chambers with a methodical completeness that his prosecutors later described as unlike anything they'd encountered in similar proceedings. He was not cooperative in the way of a man trying to minimize his exposure. He was cooperative in the way of a man trying to make sure the thing got done completely, which occasionally frustrated his own lawyers. His charges were significant. The sentence he received was reduced substantially by the cooperation and by the recovery of assets, hundreds of millions of dollars in funds, traced and seized and returned to institutional victims. But it was not a light sentence, and he didn't argue that it should be. He stood in a federal courtroom in a gray suit on a Tuesday morning in March, and listened to the sentence and did not change his expression and said, when the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, only this: I'm responsible for what I did. I'd like the record to reflect that I understand that. The judge noted it for the record. The 12 people named in the cooperation records were notified personally by a federal victim's advocate, as Hargrove had committed. 2 of them had already died of natural causes since 1999. The remaining 10 received the notification with varying degrees of distress. Legal proceedings were structured to protect their identities to the maximum extent the law allowed. Hargrove's office kept the commitment. Vance's store was standing when he went back to it. The Aldrin Street exterior showed evidence of the night's events. The front door had been forced, 2 of the window panes had been broken, and the interior had been searched thoroughly enough to leave shelves overturned and the contents of the back storage area spread across the floor. But the building stood. The basement hatch, when Vance opened it, was empty. The shelves cleared, the physical files gone, just as he'd expected. The stone walls and the bare bulb on its wire remained. He cleaned the store over the course of a week, working early mornings before the neighborhood came alive. He replaced the broken windows himself, cutting the glass to size on the workbench where he'd repaired radios for 20 years. He restocked the shelves methodically, working from a list he'd kept in his head. He repainted the letters on the front window, including the M that had been peeling at the corner. Children came in after school. Elderly neighbors gathered for coffee. The bell above the door made its small, apologetic sound each time it opened. He found the broken radio he'd been working on the night of the visit, still on the counter where he'd left it, its guts spread across the folded newspaper. He sat down and finished the repair. It took 40 minutes. When he turned it on, it played a music station, something from the 40s, horns and a piano, the kind of music that had been old when it was made and was permanent in the way that things become permanent by surviving long enough. He left it on while he worked. Reporters came, in the weeks after the indictments became public, and his name appeared in connection with the case. They stood on the sidewalk outside the store and occasionally came in and asked questions. He answered the ones he chose to answer and didn't answer the others. One of them asked why he'd kept the evidence for 25 years instead of releasing it earlier, when it might have prevented some of what came after. He thought about the question for a moment before answering. Earlier might have been safer for me, he said, but there was nobody to receive it yet. The one person who could end the empire from inside it was still becoming that person. He paused. Some things have to wait for the right conditions. Evidence without the person who can use it is just paper. The reporter wrote that down. He wasn't sure she understood it. On the last day of October, 2 weeks after he reopened the store, a man Vance didn't recognize came in just before closing. He was in his early 40s, lean, with silver at his temples, and hands that showed old work. He wore ordinary clothes, dark jacket, dark trousers, and he moved through the store without the purposefulness of someone who needed something specific. He stopped at the counter. He looked at the radio playing its old music. He looked at the repaired shelves. He looked at the coffee maker that had been replaced after the search damaged the old one. Then he looked at Vance. "Store looks good," he said. "It's a work in progress," Vance said. "Most things are." They stood on opposite sides of the counter for a moment. The radio played something instrumental, something without lyrics that was harder to place in time. "How's the shoulder?" Vance said. "2 more weeks in a brace." Dominic looked at his left hand where the knuckles had healed but not entirely smoothly. "The hand is mostly fine, some stiffness." "You look better than I expected." "I have a lot of time to sleep now." He said it without irony, or maybe with a small amount. It was hard to tell. "I have supervised time to sleep and unsupervised time to think. And the thinking is—" He stopped, looked at the radio. "The thinking is what it is." Vance nodded. "I wanted to give you something back," Dominic said. He reached into his jacket pocket and set the audio reel on the counter in its foam case. His father's handwriting on the label, still clear after everything. "You kept it for a long time. I thought you should have it." Vance looked at the reel on the counter. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way you look at something you've carried so long that setting it down requires a moment of adjustment. "It's yours," Vance said. "It's his," Dominic said. "I don't think it belongs to either of us specifically, but it should be somewhere that means something." He paused. "This is the place where everything started to end." "That seems right." Vance put his hand on the reel. He held it there, not picking it up, just the contact of his palm on the foam case. "He was a good man," Vance said. "Your father. He made a very bad thing, and he understood that it was bad, and he tried to undo it. Most people never get that far." He looked up. "You got further." Dominic looked at him for a moment. He didn't argue with it or agree with it. He just held it, the way you hold something you're not yet sure what to do with. He looked around the store, at the shelves of canned goods unevenly stacked in the specific way that suggested a person rather than a system. At the fluorescent tube overhead that had stopped flickering and burned steadily now, its replacement installed sometime during the week of cleaning. At the small television on the shelf behind the counter, this time showing the news on mute, the closed captions running along the bottom of the screen. One of the captions, he noted absently, contained his name. He looked away from it. "The ring," Vance said. "The one you burned." "In the subway station," Dominic said. "Yes." "Did it feel like anything when you did it?" Dominic thought about the question. He thought about standing in the abandoned subway station with the ring in his palm, the heat of the lighter against his thumb, the particular smell of heated metal. The way the symbol of an authority he'd never truly chosen had sat in his hand and then stopped sitting in his hand. It felt like the right thing that came too late, he said, which is the kind of thing you spend the rest of your life figuring out what to do with. Vance nodded slowly. He understood that. He'd been figuring out what to do with the same feeling for 25 years, in a store on a street that most of the city drove past without seeing. Dominic buttoned his jacket. He looked at the counter, at the audio reel sitting in Vance's hand, at the radio playing its old music. "Take care of the store," he said. "I intend to," Vance said. Dominic walked to the door. The bell made its small, apologetic sound when he pushed it open. The cold October air came in, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and rain somewhere in the distance. He stepped out onto Aldrin Street. The neighborhood was ordinary in the way that neighborhoods become ordinary when they are no longer afraid. Children on bikes in the late afternoon light, a woman walking a dog with the particular unhurried pace of someone with nowhere specific to be, a man on the corner reading something on his phone without looking over his shoulder. The ordinariness of it was not nothing. The ordinariness of it was, in fact, everything. Dominic stood on the sidewalk outside a small store on a street that barely appeared on GPS and looked at the ordinary life of a place that had spent years being ruled by fear, and he felt something move through him. Not relief, not pride, not the particular satisfaction of a resolved thing, because the thing was not resolved. It was only different, and different was its own long road. It felt more like the first full breath after a very long time of breathing shallowly. The kind of breath your body takes when it finally believes the danger has passed enough to fill the lungs completely. He took it, and then he walked down Aldrin Street in the October light, an ordinary man in ordinary clothes on a street that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be ordinary again. And behind him, through the glass of the store window, the fluorescent light burned steadily, and the radio played, and Elias Vance sat behind the counter and placed one small audio reel carefully on the shelf below the register, in the space between a box of spare batteries and an old cup of pencils, where it would be close enough to reach, but not so prominent as to demand attention. The way all real things are kept. Not hidden, not displayed, just present, just true.